Shadows twist where whispers grow. The edge of light begins to flow. A world unseen through fractured glass, where futures meet the echoes past. Step closer now, the veil is thin. A riddle starts where dreams begin. The experimental medium calls your name. Nothing here will be the same.
Today, here on the Experimental Medium podcast, we're really getting into something fascinating. The Davenport Brothers. What was it about them? Mid-19th century, right? They just seemed to explode onto the scene and really divided people. What made their mediumship so different?
Yeah, that's the core question, isn't it?
And you, our listener, you've given us some great source material, a biography, these firsthand accounts of spiritual experiences. So our mission really is to explore what made them, well, extraordinary in this whole field.
Absolutely. And when you look at the sources, the time period really jumps out. Mid-1800s, Buffalo, New York is where it kicks off.
Right.
And you have to remember, this wasn't happening in a vacuum. There's this huge public interest, curiosity maybe, about the unseen. Spiritualism was definitely a buzzword.
But also a lot of skepticism, I imagine.
Definitely. Loads of skepticism.
Yeah.
But what's interesting, the sources suggest that even within the Davenport family itself, there were, well, let's say unusual things happening before they ever went public. Sort of a prelude.
Okay, so hints of it even before the big shows. That's interesting. So for you listening, let's dive into the actual phenomena. What were they doing, or what was supposedly happening that caused such a stir?
Well, it's the sheer range and how things escalated that really grabs you. It started relatively small, you might say, rappings.
Rappings, like knocks on the wall?
Sort of. Intelligent knocks, supposedly. Taps that could answer questions, spell things out. Then you had tables moving, turning over, sometimes sliding across the room with, seemingly no one touching them.
Okay.
And lights. People reported seeing unexplained lights appearing in darkened rooms. And then the music. This is a big one.
Ah, the floating instruments. I read about that.
Exactly. Guitars, banjos, tambourines, just floating in the air, playing tunes. And this was supposedly happening even when the brothers were tied up, restrained.
Tied up and instruments playing themselves in the dark. It sounds theatrical, doesn't it? But you said it escalated?
Oh, yeah. It went way beyond that. The sources talk about levitation.
Of objects.
Of the brothers themselves, and apparently even their sisters sometimes. There's an early account of young Ira being lifted, like 9 feet off the ground, moved across a room. People claim they could even feel him pass by overhead.
9 feet? That's hard to picture.
And later claims mention both brothers, Ira and William, and their sister Elizabeth, all levitating at the same time. Imagine seeing that.
Wow. Yeah, okay, the visual impact alone. But then it got even more interactive, didn't it? Phantom hands.
The phantom hands. These accounts were incredibly vivid. People didn't just see them, they claimed to feel them.
Feel them how?
Like human hands, appearing out of nowhere. They'd apparently pick things up, move objects around, but also touch people.
Touching observers.
Yeah, pulling hair, putting objects into their hands. And the weird thing, they'd often just dissolve, vanish instantly. That direct physical contact is, well, pretty unique in these kinds of accounts.
Okay, feeling is definitely another level beyond just seeing. So seeing lights, feeling hands. How did they communicate? Did these phenomena not speak?
That's where the independent voices come in. Another major part of their act. Or mediumship, depending on your view.
Independent voices, meaning not coming from the brothers.
Exactly. Voices speaking from apparently empty space in the room. Sometimes they used trumpets, these horns would float around, and the voices would seem to come out amplified.
And what did the voices say?
They'd apparently hold conversations, answer questions from the audience, and sometimes, this is pretty startling, they seem to predict things.
Predict the future? Like what?
Well, we'll get to a specific example later, but yeah.
Yeah.
But there's also mention of one particular voice described as really deep, sepulchral even. Added to the whole spooky atmosphere, I guess.
Sepulchral voices predicting things.
Yeah.
Okay. It keeps getting stranger. You mentioned objects moving earlier, like the instruments. Were there other examples, almost like a poltergeist stuff?
Yeah, definitely echoes of that. Beyond the music, One account mentions a hat full of water just suddenly appearing on a table.
A hat full of water out of nowhere.
Apparently. And another story tells of a vase getting knocked off a mantelpiece, crashing down, but then being found totally unharmed. And the instruments, again, sometimes described as flying really fast in circles in the dark. But interestingly, if someone suddenly shone a light,
They'd stop.
instantly, they'd just drop.
Okay.
So darkness seemed pretty crucial, didn't it?
Yeah, it sounds like it. Either needed for the effect or to the method, I suppose. Now, there's one thing in the sources that just seems physically impossible, especially with them being tied up. The coats.
Ah, yes. The coat removal and transposition. For you listening, this is one of the absolute classics associated with the Davenports.
Can you describe that? It sounds wild.
It really is. People, observers, would be securely tied up. Sometimes the brothers, sometimes audience members invited to participate. We're talking ropes, knots, sometimes even sealed with wax.
Really secure.
And then, in apparently an instant, in the dark, coats would be taken off these securely bound people.
Taken off while they're still tied.
That's the claim. And even more amazingly, sometimes coats would be exchanged between two different people, both still tied up.
Okay, hold on. Exchange, like my coat ends up on you, yours on me, and we're both still tied hand and foot.
In a fraction of a second, according to the accounts. The sheer seeming impossibility of it, given the bindings often applied by skeptics trying to catch them out, is what makes it so perplexing. It really pushes the limits.
Yeah, no kidding. Defies simple explanation, that's for sure. So this brings us to the question of, well, who was actually watching all this? Were these just, easily fooled people? Or did they attract serious attention?
Oh, it was a real mix, definitely not just believers. Early on, back in Buffalo, you had respected local folks, like an auctioneer named Mr. Plimpton, people whose word carried some weight locally.
Okay, credible locals to start.
But then it spread, and they drew attention from, well, academics and scientists. Figures like Professor Pierce and Professor Agassiz from Harvard actually investigated them.
Harvard professors, did they figure it out?
Well, that's the interesting part. They investigated, but they never published any public report explaining it away, or confirming it for that matter. Kind of intriguing silence. But then you have someone like Professor D. Morgan.
The mathematician.
Yes, the logician and mathematician. In private letters, he apparently admitted he thought some genuine phenomena were happening, even if he couldn't explain how.
So even serious thinkers were intrigued, maybe a bit baffled. What about the press and the spiritualist community itself? For you listening, this must have been big news.
Huge news. The media was all over it. Big papers like the New York Herald, the New York World, they gave them tons of coverage. It shows how much public fascination there was. The editor of the Herald, Mr. Bennett, even wrote editorials, so it was part of the public conversation.
And the spiritualists must have loved them. Or been skeptical, too.
Mostly embraced them, it seems. Prominent spiritualists like a Mr. Howitt saw them in London and became absolutely convinced they were the real deal. And you had other investigators like S.C. Hall and his wife holding private sessions, really trying to get to the bottom of it.
So a real cross-section, then. Locals, scientists, journalists, believers. And they didn't just stay in the U.S., did they? I read they went international. Listeners might not know that part.
That's right. Their fame took them to Europe. They performed for royalty.
Royalty? Like who?
Emperor Napoleon III and Empress Eugenie of France, apparently, and even Tsar and Tsarina of Russia. Getting audiences like that really says something about the level of intrigue they generated worldwide.
Wow. Okay, so with that level of fame and these kinds of claims, the skepticism must have been intense. People must have been desperate to prove it was all fake.
Absolutely relentless skepticism. They were constantly under the microscope. People were determined to expose them. Committees were formed all the time just for that purpose.
What kind of things did they do to try and catch them?
Oh, increasingly elaborate stuff. Really complex ways of tying them up. Multiple ropes, wire, sealing wax on the knot so you could tell if they'd been undone. Observers watching their every move, or trying to, in the dark.
And yet, the phenomena kept happening. For you listening, this is where it gets really tricky for the skeptics, right?
Exactly.
Yep.
That's the narrative presented in these sources anyway. There are accounts of these committees trying their absolute best, using what they thought were foolproof methods, and failing to stop the phenomena or find trickery.
Like the Cleveland one.
Yeah, the Cleveland Committee is a good example. Elaborate bindings, sealed tapes. But the reports say instruments still played, hands appeared, and crucially, the seals were found intact afterwards. Failures like that just fueled the mystery.
The sources mention some specific incidents that sound almost impossible to stage, even for the biggest skeptic listening right now.
Definitely. The Oswego jailhouse seance is pretty remarkable.
In jail.
Yeah, they were literally handcuffed to the bars of a jail cell, completely restrained. Yet, reports claim a trumpet moved around inside the cell, and a voice spoke clearly from it. Even the jailer, who started out totally convinced it was fraud, apparently admitted afterwards that what he saw needed scientific investigation.
Handcuffed to bars. Okay. What about attempts to, secretly see what was happening in the dark?
Ah, the dark lantern incidents. People tried that hiding lanterns, planning to flick them on suddenly to catch the brothers moving. But supposedly, the spirits would announce the presence of the hidden lantern through rappings before it could be used.
Seriously, like they knew.
As if they were one step ahead. It sort of turns the debunking attempt back on itself, making it part of the strange phenomena.
That's quite a twist. And what about people inside the famous cabinet with them? Surely they'd see any trickery up close.
That's another strong point raised by believers. People who were allowed inside the cabinet while the brothers were tied up often swore afterwards that the phenomena, the hands, the instruments, happened completely independently, that the brothers didn't or couldn't have done it themselves, given their restraints.
They mentioned a specific knot, too, didn't they? The tomfool knot.
The Tom Bull knot, I think it was called, used in leads, apparently.
Yeah.
The sources suggest that using this particularly tricky knot satisfied many observers there that the bindings were genuinely secure.
Okay, secure knots, witnesses inside. But what about that prediction you mentioned, the one that seemed to come before the news arrived? That seemed like a different kind of evidence. For you listening, this is really food for thought.
Right, the Fort Sumter incident in Chicago. This one is often cited. The story goes that the voice, speaking through the trumpet during a seance, announced the bombardment of Fort Sumter, the start of the Civil War.
Before the news arrived publicly.
And apparently gave updates, with details that were later confirmed by telegraph, but the voice reportedly provided them first, and sometimes even more accurately than the initial messy telegraph reports. If true, that suggests, well, some other source of information.
Yeah, that's hard to explain away with just ropes and cabinets. And there was also Professor Mapes, wasn't there? He had a very physical experience.
Yes, Professor Mapes' account is fascinating. He claimed he actually felt a large, physical-seeming hand during a seance, and he was apparently able to examine Ira Davenport while Ira remained tied, trying to figure out what was going on.
What was his conclusion?
His idea was pretty out there for the time. He suggested some kind of temporary incarnation, like an entity forming itself, maybe using elements drawn from the mediums. It implies the mediums weren't just passive channels, but maybe actively contributing something physical.
Which neatly brings us to the big question, for you listening. If it wasn't just trickery, how on earth did they supposedly do these things? What were the mechanics behind, say, physical materializations like those hands? The sources must have touched on theories.
They did. But it's important for you to grasp that there wasn't, and still isn't, any single accepted scientific explanation. It was, and remains, deeply mysterious from a conventional standpoint.
So what did people at the time think? The spiritualists, for instance.
Well, the main spiritualist view, reflected strongly in these sources, was that disembodied spirits were the ones doing it. That spirits had some kind of power, unknown to science, that allowed them to interact with our physical world.
So the Davenports themselves weren't the source of the power, just the means, like conduits.
Exactly. They were often described as passive instruments. Mediums, in the true sense of the word, channels through which this spiritual energy or power could manifest physically.
Passive instruments. But Professor Makes' idea hinted at something more.
Right, there were variations. One hypothesis mentioned is that the invisibles, the spirits, really incarnate themselves from elements emanating in great part from the persons of the media.
Emanating from the mediums, like the spirits were using the brothers' own energy or body stuff somehow.
That seems to be the implication of that particular theory, the kind of energetic borrowing, or perhaps the mediums provided the raw material, you might say, for these temporary physical forms or effects.
Huh. Raw material. That's a strange concept.
It is, and the sources sometimes dip into even more, well, esoteric ideas. There's a brief mention of something called a peculiar sun within the spiritual spheres, maybe suggesting a different energy source or reality from which these phenomena originated. It shows people were really grappling for explanations beyond the everyday.
Definitely sounds like they were reaching for ways to understand something completely outside their normal experience. So, as we wrap up this deep dive from the Experimental Medium podcast on the Davenports, Thinking about the levitation, the voices, the coats, the scrutiny, what are the really key things for you, our listener, that made their story so extraordinary and, frankly, so enduringly weird?
I think it's a combination, really. The sheer range of phenomena, from subtle sounds to apparently solid hands and levitating bodies, and the conditions under which these things reportedly happen, often with skeptics actively trying and failing to debunk them using pretty stringent methods.
The coat thing still gets me.
The coat transposition, yeah. Things like that, the independent voices giving verifiable info, the levitation, they just seem so far beyond standard magic tricks or illusions of the time. And the fact that credible people, even some scientists, were left scratching their heads. It all contributes to this persistent mystery.
It really is hard to just brush it all off as simple fraud, isn't it? Especially considering how many people saw it, how closely they were watched. But as the sources show, they were always controversial. Many people were convinced it was just a clever act.
Absolutely. And that's the core tension, isn't it? You have these incredibly detailed, often firsthand accounts of impossible-seeming events, witnessed under test conditions. Yet the belief that it must have been trickery persists. They were figures of huge controversy then, and honestly, the debate hasn't entirely gone away.
Which leaves us, and you the listener, with a pretty profound question, I think. What does this enduring mystery of the Davenport brothers really tell us? Maybe about the limits of what we think we know about the physical world, or the potential for things, well, outside our current science.
Exactly. Were they genuinely tapping into something beyond normal human ability, these extraordinary mediums? Or were they just illusionists, con artists maybe, but on a scale with a skill that was simply unprecedented? The sources give us compelling stories, compelling evidence on both sides almost. But that final answer, like the nature of whatever power they seem to wield, is still very much open for you to consider.
Whispers creeping through the haze, shadows dance in twisted ways, echoes hum from worlds unseen. This is where the strange convene. Step into the unknown mind, secrets hidden, twist and bind, truths that linger in between. Welcome to the spectral stream. A voice that stirs the silent night, guides you through the fading light. Journeys deep beyond the real, where unseen forces are revealed. Step into the unknown mind, secrets hidden, twist and bind, truths that linger in between. Welcome to the spectral stream. Electric sparks and haunted tones, reality's edge. memory's edge becomes your home. Questions rise like fragile smoke. The uncharted realm silently spoke.